The impudence, the audacity, the unmitigated gall of those knuckleheads of liberty podcasters, daring to voice opinions outside the mainstream of accepted thought. Listen if you dare. It's angry, it's funny, it's even sometimes sad, but it's always based on freedom and justice, as you will see. Here's our host, Jason McPhee.
Welcome to the Knuckleheads of Liberty. We're coming at you on November 30th, 2022, just a week after Thanksgiving. And we're again thankful to have Eric Cohn from the as a director of marketing and communications of the Acton Institute. With us here today, and we're going to focus on freedom, faith, and China in this particular discussion topics. But before we do that, let me introduce you to our panel. In our upper left-hand corner, we have Leon, the word Brathwaite, last word in liberty. He is a retired engineer in the state of California. In my upper right-hand corner, we have Eric Cohn, our guest today. And my name is Jason McPhee, and I'll be your host. So maybe we could get a visual, James. Jumping right into China. Boy, I tell you, we were sort of planning to talk about China about a week ago, and then suddenly all kinds of stuff started breaking out in China recently. Certainly there's been a lot of unrest around COVID. We've seen, all kinds of ridiculous things happening, of crackdowns and against people's liberty. Essentially at the beginning of the COVID crisis, people being welded into their hotel or into their apartments and homes just to keep people quarantined. And then we've seen all kinds of issues since then. I mean, I've even heard about people being stranded in places like Disneyland in China because, if they're found out they have COVID, they don't let them just freely move around. So there's just all kinds of crazy stuff. Well, that's all come to a head these last few days where they're still kind of on a zero COVID policy. And so, I thought I'd show a few images of what's going on. It's kind of interesting. There's sort of this white paper thing they're talking about in the revolution here, where to get past the censors, they're holding up sheets of paper with nothing on them, and they're trying to communicate, as this woman is with chains and the piece of paper, that they're being repressed. And if they put words on the paper, then they're afraid that the images would get censored automatically. So they put no words on the paper to try and get around some of these things, which is just incredible. And of course, you can see the same thing happening in some of these groups. And these are just some other images taking place. One of the things I thought was kind of interesting just to show too from this one website, they were showing the Chinese leader here, Xi Jinping, walking in front of his troops. And I thought this was really telling, as they have all these rules for everybody regarding COVID. And you can see all the soldiers have to wear their masks. And of course, the leader doesn't wear a mask walking right in front of him, kind of like we see in a lot of local politics, especially around California, where we're from over here.
Go look for Xi Jinping at the French Laundry. Yeah,
exactly. So, and this sort of takes us back, though. I mean, we've seen this steady stream of evolution in the Chinese culture, and it was just about 30 years ago that we had the infamous image of Tank Man, and to me that was one of the images that most I guess portrays individual liberty, standing for individual liberty. Here is a lone man with a grocery bag, I believe, in his hand, and he's standing in front of a column of tanks as they're coming to put down a student revolution in Tiananmen Square. And I just, it's funny, that guy disappeared. Nobody's ever seen him since, but his legend lives on.
I would encourage people to check out a film from a friend of mine, Robert Anthony Peters, called Tank Man, in which it's about a 12-minute film where Robert imagines what was this man's life like leading up to this moment. What is his day leading up to this moment where he found himself standing in front of this column of tanks at Tiananmen Square. It's a really neat film. I'd encourage people to check it out.
Yeah. And, if you want a lot of background too, PBS's Frontline had a good 1 or 2 hour documentary on this, and it really went into the whole protest leading up to this moment.
Yeah.
And some of the journalists who were there who got this picture, and it's funny, the story behind that is he had to hide it in the toilet, because sure enough, people had seen him snapping pictures, and they were at his a hotel room, taking his camera. So it's really quite an impressive thing. But
we cover as well the Tiananmen Square in our film The Hong Konger, Jimmy Lai's Extraordinary Struggle for Freedom. I think one of the things that's really important for people to understand is that it so much gets focused into this single image, right? This was a protest that was going on for a period of time, not just in Tiananmen Square, but really in many places around China. Some of the footage that we have of it in the film, to me, is somewhat remarkable. This young Chinese student saying, this is not a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It's just expressly American rhetoric. It is something that kind of came out of the ether once. And I think we can be hopeful that what we're seeing in China right now is it happening again. And you mentioned it being in response to COVID policies that China has, this zero COVID policy that they have implemented across the country, and what all that has meant. And that is true that this is the impetus for it, right? But to say that it is just about COVID is similar to saying that all of the Arab Spring was about a fruit vendor's access to what he could and could not do. It represents so much more than that. And that desire, that yearning for human freedom, which really is a tapestry of freedoms, as our co-founder, Father Robert Sirico, makes that point in the film. That is what human freedom is. It is a tapestry of other freedoms, and there is, as we talked about on a previous episode of the show, that yearning for it within the human spirit. And I think we're seeing that amongst people in China. It's just they got to find that thing that really piques that feeling in them, and it has been in response to COVID policy that starts it. But it to me is about so much more than just COVID policy.
Yeah, that's such a good point. If I may tell you a little history here, just the last Thursday in February of 2020, James, the guy behind the scene here, and Jason,
it's our invisible hand.
Our invisible hand, yes. We were on a show discussing what COVID policy should be going forward, and one of the things that we were debating whether sick people should be quarantined. And a few weeks later, all of us were quarantined. All of us were told to stay home, and we couldn't go out. Or if we do go out, we have to go out under these conditions. And so it really bothers me to see all these things we are looking at in China and these other places where there's this yearning for freedom, and people are really risking their lives in some cases and livelihoods to try to get that thing of liberty and freedom that we seem to take so much for granted here in the United States. But the COVID shutdown came about and shows that maybe we should not take it for granted as we do. I am not saying that we shouldn't take precautions if there's a health emergency, as there was. But the extent of the lockdowns and these sort of things really make you wonder whether we are living in a constitutional republic as is claimed. It was really kind of scary to me.
I think the searching for a sense of reasonableness, especially at the beginning and the onset of the pandemic, was to me always kind of a struggle, right? I think, and let this be an unpopular opinion if it's an unpopular opinion, things that we decided collectively as a society through the elected officials that we have put into positions to make decisions like this, which I think often in many cases were too deferential to experts, because the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they have one writ, right? That writ is to prevent and control diseases. They would do it at the expense of all other concerns. The reason we elect political leaders is to balance the other concerns that exist there. But I was always of the mind that things that we did in March and April of 2020, given what we knew at the time, we can look back with the knowledge we have now and think that was completely unreasonable. We didn't need to or shouldn't have done any of that stuff. But based on what we knew then, was reasonable. you have to change when the information on the ground changes. And the problem was people in those positions of leadership did not change when the facts on the ground changed. And things that started as understandable and reasonable became increasingly more unreasonable over time. I think that that is a fair argument to make. There were plenty of people who were principally opposed to COVID mitigation measures from the very beginning. I think that they were, the longer we went on, vindicated. But I also think that it is a dangerously ideological position to hold, that irrespective of any of the context and any of the facts on the ground. So one of the things I do think government is empowered to do, I'm not an anarchist, so I think there is a role for the government, is to deal with health crises like that. We certainly can be critical of the way that they actually did it. But I don't think that the people who were against everything from the very beginning have been vindicated in the way that they think they are.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, I could understand that position. To me, it's reasonable. However, I mean, look at the lockdown of the schools, which I thought was really horrendous. Okay, let us say, okay, we could give them some time period, some period, transition period, whatever you want to call it, and maybe they had to lock down the schools in the spring of 2020. But by the time we got around to the fall, the new school year, we all knew that children were the least vulnerable.
100%. Yeah.
Right? We all knew this. But
this
still,
is my point.
the schools were locked down.
Yeah,
so something went tragically wrong there.
Absolutely.
Even after we got information about who is the most vulnerable population and who is the least vulnerable population, we had that information by the fall of 2020. But yet the schools remain shut down.
Yep.
Well, I think one of the key takeaways, at least to me in all this, is that when you step away from a voluntary society, it's pretty hard to maintain a moral society as well, because once you do that, it's all top down. I mean, you're essentially ceding that power to somebody else to make these decisions. I mean, we saw countless examples of governors who jumped in and said, emergency powers, I'm here to protect everybody. And the emergency is still going on.
They just
3 years later.
extended the emergency for the purpose of continuing the pause on student loan payments, which is just, it is lawless. There's no other way to put it. It is absolutely lawless.
Exactly.
It is not still an emergency of the same kind, even if it did justify at the very beginning, which I think is certainly a question that is up for debate of whether COVID justified pausing student loan payments to the federal government. Certainly now, November 30th, 2022, it is not the case anymore. And yet, you empower people like that, and it becomes very hard to take it away.
Well, let's transition into Hong Kong, because it's funny, we were literally planning to talk about Hong Kong, and all this other stuff came up on China. So, but I think it's funny because this is really an integral story, I think, to what's going on in China as well. And it's funny because there was this natural experiment that happened. For those of you who aren't aware of the background, let's see, there's a little map here. So Hong Kong is this little area right here in the southern part of China, and essentially the British through I don't know whether it's the Opium Wars or whatever it was, way back a long time ago.
Result of the Opium Wars, yeah.
Yeah, and so they had a negotiation, I guess, as they left China, that they were maintaining control of this area, and so that's why it had a different structure than the rest.
There are two areas of Hong Kong. There is the island of Hong Kong, and then there are the new territories that surround it. The new territories the British had on a 99-year lease. That 99-year lease came up in 1997, which is when the handover of Hong Kong to China takes place. The negotiations for that really started in 1987, I believe, because it is Margaret Thatcher who's the one who basically had set the policy that she just was of the belief that they couldn't extend the lease, and the other area, the island, they had in perpetuity. That was not leased from the Chinese. They could have kept it, and they chose to give it back. Mary Kissel, who was formerly with the Wall Street Journal in Southeast Asia, former advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who appears in our film, calls it Margaret Thatcher's greatest mistake. I think you can make a compelling case for that. But Jason, the event that you were at where we showed this film, Samuel Chu, who's a brilliant gentleman, I encourage people to look up on social media. He also appears in the film, made a point in a way that I hadn't quite thought about it before, as we've been talking about concepts of freedom and human agency here, that Hong Kongers have this kind of half joke that because it's a British colony, the British negotiate with the Chinese for this handover in 1997, and then now it's controlled by China under this one country, two systems philosophy that the Chinese started backing away from almost immediately after the handover in 97. But the half joke that Hong Kongers have is Hong Kong has only ever existed for 30 seconds. That was the 30 seconds in between when the Union Jack flag came down and the Chinese flag for Hong Kong went up. The people who got left out of the conversation about their own future were Hong Kongers. The British didn't have them at the table. The Chinese didn't have them at the table. These were people who were negotiated over by other world powers. And I think we see that infiltrating the way that we talk about a lot of foreign affairs questions, where, we look at what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. And there's this insistence by some that, the United States and Russia should sit down and figure out what to do with Ukraine. Well, what about the Ukrainians? What about the people whose lives you're actually talking about and negotiating over? They have human agency as well. They are the ones who should be a party to this at the minimum, if not the focal point in the forefront of it. So I think it is something that has lived in my mind since I heard Samuel say it, that is the forgotten people in this conversation are the actual citizens of Hong Kong who've been left out. What they want has been left out of the conversation pretty much at every juncture.
Well, and real quick, just to jump in, this is a commonality, I think, whenever you have central planning and big government sort of over things, is that you have these planners and they really don't have all the information. Maybe sometimes they're just overlooking things, but there's just this information bottleneck that happens when you put all the power in the government to make decisions. And so even if they are good in motivation, which, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, Margaret Thatcher in making these negotiations, the bottom line is when you're doing it from that high level perspective, you're just not going to get all the information from the people from the ground. I don't understand why you wouldn't just let the people of Hong Kong, or at least that island, have made that decision for themselves. But
it is the definition of the forgotten man. The forgotten man is the concept that A and B decide what C is going to do for D. In this case, C is the citizens of Hong Kong. A and B decided what C lives are going to be like, and they get left out of the entire process. And it's worth pointing out as well, we point this out in the film, that you didn't have a fully realized set of freedoms in the same way that the British do or that Americans do in Hong Kong. They weren't enfranchised in the same way, but they did have, as by virtue of being a British colony, a lot of these systems that I think we do have a tendency to take for granted: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the rule of law, things that are absolutely necessary for us to exist as free human beings, these structures that are so incredibly important. So I think that is, it's a sad story that they've been the ones who've kind of been forgotten.
Yeah. Well, and for those viewers of ours who aren't that familiar, and James, maybe you can bring the images back up real quick. So back in, I believe it was around 2014, maybe 2015, there was a, or it might have been just a little bit later, there was a law that was passed. So there was sort of a gradual erosion of the people of Hong Kong's.
You're talking about the national security law?
Yeah, the national security law comes about in response to the 2019 umbrella movement protests. But there had been, we document this in our film, The Hong Konger, as well, these various either proposed laws or passed laws. The first one that really generated a lot of protest there was an extradition bill, which would have allowed people charged with crimes in Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China to either be tried there or at minimum serve prison sentences there. That was withdrawn, but it really laid the groundwork, and the response to that, which is the umbrella movement, is the response to that proposed legislation, laid the groundwork for the national security law that currently exists, which I described on the other episode of this show that we did, but I'll describe it real quickly again for people who are concerned about concepts of the rule of law. It is an abomination. It is an incredibly vaguely written statute that can be interpreted however China wants to interpret it, which of course is the intention. It applies retroactively. It applies extranationally. Every day, what I'm doing to promote our film, the people who spoke in that film, people who work in other parts of the world on Hong Kong issues are in daily violation of the national security law in Hong Kong, even though they are not citizens of that region. They are not subject to the legal justice system of that region. You know, they are still nonetheless in violation of that law. It is truly an abomination, and it is a vehicle that the Chinese Communist Party is using to go after people like Jimmy Lai, who have been promoting the ideas of freedom and democracy in Hong Kong.
Yeah. And just to give people just a little bit of a sense, so certainly go check the movie out. But Jimmy Lai, he was a owner of a newspaper there. He had sort of worked his way up as just a poor kid on the streets to eventually owning a newspaper in Hong Kong. And his newspaper eventually started, was a little more committed to printing the truth rather than what mainland China wanted printed, I guess.
And advocating for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. Jimmy he made his fortune with a chain of clothing stores, actually. I mean, he came from China to Hong Kong with absolutely nothing. Worked in a textile factory. Turned it into this company, Giordano, which was a huge clothing line that not only raced through Hong Kong, but also was available in mainland China. I enjoy the anecdote that's in the film as someone who lived in Chicago for 15 years. He got the name Giordano from coming back from a trip to the States with a napkin from a restaurant in his pocket. Giordano's, the pizza restaurant in Chicago. I was like, this is Giordano. This Italian name sounds much more like a designer than a Chinese name. That's what I'll call it. And then he wants to do something more meaningful with his life, which is why, as he says in footage that we have in the film, if I'm providing information, I'm providing choice. And choice is freedom. So he starts Next Magazine. He starts Apple Daily, which was the most successful daily newspaper in Hong Kong, Chinese language, and in favor of the idea of freedom and democracy. And it was always an eyesore for the Chinese, and which is why it does not exist today, largely because the actions the Chinese Communist Party took to harass and arrest Jimmy under national security law charges, as well as some others, to seize the bank accounts of Apple Daily and Jimmy's personal bank accounts as well. So they ran out of money. They ended up shutting down 2 years ago. The last issue of which they published, we have incredible footage in the film of people lining up around corners to get a copy of the last issue of Apple Daily. And it's a sad story, but I look at what Jimmy has chosen to do. There's this incredibly impressive man that we interviewed for the film, Lord Patton, was the last British colonial governor of Hong Kong. And he has this line in the film that always sticks with me when he's talking about what Jimmy has chosen to do in facing the authorities in Hong Kong. He has British citizenship. He could have gone there. He's a billionaire. He could have gone to Taiwan. He could have come to the United States, and he chose to stay. And Lord Patton says he's been incredibly principled and brave. And I wish I could think that I would have been as brave. And you just hear this recognition in his voice that he knows he wouldn't have. And I think that is something that is true for most of us. What Jimmy has chosen to do is exceptional, which is why we wanted to tell the story. It's heroic. It is truly the kind of thing that most people have the capability to do, but it is incredibly hard to make that choice. And I think the lesson that we can take from Jimmy's story is most of us will never be faced with a circumstance like he is facing, but those individual moments in our own lives where we're challenged in a similar way, and it's the question of what do we do? Do we do the right thing, right? The courage is the formation of all the other virtues at their testing point. Can we be courageous when the moment calls on us to be courageous? And I think that is what the film causes me to meditate on.
Well, as a juxtaposition too, sorry, Leon, I just wanted to make this one point. In Jimmy Lai's case, he put everything on the line, his newspaper, his freedom, everything, in order to stand for the truth. And I put that as a juxtaposition to what we're seeing currently in the United States with the media, where we literally just had a press conference at the White House where they had Fauci there and the press secretary, and somebody tried to ask the question, because this is the last opportunity they were going to have to ask this man who has more knowledge about the origins of COVID probably than anybody in government probably has. And he was literally silenced by the press secretary, and the rest of the press just dutifully sat there, at least most of them did, without, just listening to whatever the government told them to do, instead of challenging and asking the questions for the public could know. I just thought, wow.
And in a lower stakes environment than what we were just talking about with Hong Kong. Yeah.
But this is what the parallels I was trying to raise, and Jason, that's a good point you're raising there. These are the parallels I'm trying to raise. Even though, Eric, you're correct in terms of degrees of what we are seeing, but my point is, and my concern is, we are on this path to maybe serfdom, if I could quote Hyatt here. Look at what happened in Canada when we had the truckers strike. The convoy, and they were in Ottawa and all that kind of stuff. Look at what the government was trying to do. Justin Trudeau.
Yeah.
His government. Look at what they were trying to do in terms of seizing bank accounts, in terms of shutting people down, even people who supported the truckers. Some of their accounts were seized and all this sort of things. And this was happening in Canada, which is supposed to be supposedly is one of the freest countries in the world.
So I always like to make this point. I always like to make this point about one of the reasons why I am eternally hopeful about America as just being kind of different. This is what is really truly meant by the concept of American exceptionalism. We hear exceptionalism and we tend to think of it the way that our sixth grade teacher would say that we're exceptional and pat us on our head. It doesn't just mean good. It really means that we are different. We are an exception. And there was this incredible unintentional social experiment between the United States and Canada that happened over the course of 200 years. In the 1770s, if you were a loyalist or a royalist, you went to or remained in Canada, where the crown was still the government. After the Revolution, or if you were inclined to the Revolution, you were in or stayed in the colonies, which became the United States of America. Fast forward 200 years. In 1976, both the governments of Canada and the United States announced we're switching to the metric system. And the Canadians said, okay, and the Americans said, no, we're not. And it is just that sentiment of Americans that I think still does endure, that we do not like being told what to do. And there is a point at, I think we even saw this, we talked about COVID stuff earlier, there was just a point where even, people who were willing to go along with what the regime was in the very beginning, just eventually got to the point of, no, I'm not doing this anymore. And that kind of inclination towards disobedience, I still think courses through the American spirit. There are challenges to it. So Leon, I do share some of your concerns, but I remain hopeful that spirit that once said, we're not switching to the metric system, which is just kind of pointless and irrelevant. Like, what is, it actually, sets of 10 are much more easy to compute than the imperial system that we use. So it made no sense, but it was just that, no, you're not going to tell us what to do. And I think that still kind of courses through the veins of this country.
Fair enough. As somebody with a background in engineering, and I certainly know Leon can appreciate this too, I wish we'd switch to the metric system, but I Prefer liberty over an easy counting system. So I'll take that. But I was going to try and discuss Taiwan, but I definitely wanted to get into faith in China, and we're sort of running short, so let me jump straight to that. So James, maybe you could bring up the image real quick here. So religion in China is something where they claim you have a right to believe in a faith, but essentially there's all these rules that govern what it is you can actually believe.
They claim you have a right to believe in a faith. Go ask the Uyghurs about that.
Exactly.
Right. That's a good point.
And I mean, this is the crazy thing. Like there's literally only apparently 5 officially recognized religions. And if you don't fall under Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, or Protestantism, everything else is considered to be superstition to them, apparently, which is, and then they will tell you too, it has to be Orthodox. And if it's got any variations in it, then it's some kind of a weird cult. And so they're going to make that illegal too. And so that's manifested itself with the Uyghurs, as you just mentioned, essentially about 1 million of them being thrown into camps, re-education camps and such, to keep them from being able to practice their faith. And, it's pretty horrible. But I don't know. Maybe you guys want to jump in on this before.
I know we're short on time, so I'll just make this brief point about it. This is a atrocity. It is genocidal, and what really tries my patience is, we revile what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s and the Holocaust, and we often hear invoked the idea of never again. And you look around the world and you see places where the exact same kind of thing is happening again. It is happening with the Uyghurs in China. Iran is possibly going to execute 14,000 people because they were protesting against the repressive, totalitarian, authoritarian regime that exists in that country. You look at what is happening in Russia, and I don't want us to stop saying never again. I want us to mean it when we actually say it.
Indeed. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And this is where I think, it's funny because we have, this is part of the scary thing. When COVID came up, everybody took their lead from China, which is, sort of a scary thing because China was the first place that sort of cracked down on it. And then we started getting vibes that, hey, maybe it's coming here too. And then officials started scrambling. And then suddenly we were talking lockdowns, which we couldn't believe. Yeah. And like Leon was saying earlier, we'd had a discussion on a sort of a sister show called Libertarian Counterpoint that we do. And we were literally debating, is it okay to even quarantine sick people? And before we knew it, we were all quarantined. Sick and healthy. Yeah. So, but it was, but as far as that goes, they seem to be taking some of this disrespect for religion along the same path, because during COVID, we saw all of these impositions hitting people being able to have their free, their liberty to practice religion. And so pastors were arrested. There was even a few weird cases where pastors were trying to comply with COVID concerns by having these their services with their people in their own cars. Yeah. And they were still harassed by the government for doing these things, which is just absolutely insane. But all the while, politicians were telling us that kind of gathering was not okay. But if you were gathering to protest the police or something else, maybe if it was a BLM.
For social justice.
Exactly. Yes. Then suddenly it was okay to get together in large groups. In fact, you didn't even have to wear a mask, as Lori Lightfoot is demonstrating here in Chicago when she was demonstrating with a BLM protest, I believe it was at the time. And there was just this litany of hypocrisy among the candidates. We had our own Governor Newsom here in California, who was dining at the French Laundry while he was having some areas of the state shut down their restaurants and telling everybody to mask up. He was literally dining with health industry lobbyists at the time. So, and then nobody was wearing a mask, and
and they were not social distancing either.
Unfortunately, I'm running short on time as well, so I should probably get going in a minute here.
Sure. So, anyways, so let's tie it down to our knucklehead noise patrol. But this sort of brings it all to the point where Justin Trudeau, Canada's prime minister, the admiration that some of our leaders tend to have for the authoritarian rule in China is just appalling, especially what we're seeing now. And I think it kind of sums it up. He was asked a question back in 2013, which nation he admired most, and Justin Trudeau said, "There's a level of admiration I actually have for China. Their basic dictatorship is actually allowing them to turn their economy around on a dime." And I think, that kind of says it in a nutshell. What's wrong with those places and why we don't want to be.
This is the wrong Friedman, Thomas Friedman's long-running desire to be China for a day, to just have pure totalitarian power, to fix all the things that he thinks needs to be fixed. It's the same kind of thing could be said as, like, does he want to be Nazi Germany for a day? I mean, that reveals just kind of the ridiculousness about it. But I'll give you one more Trudeau anecdote on the way out here. This from let's see, a quote from Trudeau here. "If you join the protest because you're tired of COVID, you now need to understand you were breaking the law," about the trucker protest that we talked about earlier. Another quote now from Justin Trudeau. "Everyone in China should be allowed to protest. We will continue to ensure that China knows we will stand for human rights and with the people who are expressing themselves." So good going there.
Yeah. Well,
the little dictator to the north, he admires China, I understand
this has been a great
Fidel Castro.
Well, this has been a great discussion, and thanks so much for joining us, Eric, on this. And by the way, James, could you bring up this website again real quick, just so we can show it on the way out? So if you want to find out more about the stuff Eric's doing over at Acton, it is at www.acton.org, and you can find out more about it. Eric, is there anything you wanted to say on the way out?
No, I again encourage people to check out acton.org. Check out the content that we publish on a daily basis there. They can subscribe if they're interested to our quarterly magazine, Religion and Liberty, by checking out the Religion and Liberty section of that website. And I encourage people again to check out the HongKongerMovie.com, which is the Jimmy Lai's Extraordinary Struggle for Freedom. The trailer is available there, and information about when it is available for streaming will be available as soon as we know.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And if you're interested in hearing a little more too, we did another podcast where we specifically focused on the Acton Institute. So you can go there and listen to us talking with Eric a little more on that. Thanks again, everybody, so much for joining us. And until the next time, stay free.
Yes, indeed. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, always and forever.
Thank you for listening to the Knuckleheads of Liberty podcast. Find us on Facebook, Rumble, YouTube, your favorite podcast network, and at knuckleheadsofliberty.com.